Hello and welcome to today's Philosophy Bites. We're going to mention a little bit about natural moral law. Natural moral law, the Catholic teachings that underpins the Catholic Church, coming from Aristotle. The first idea that Aristotle gave was the idea that everything has a purpose. When we look around us at nature, we can look at animals, we can look at trees, we can look at things that we make. So, for example, Aristotle uses the example of a knife. A good knife. What does a good knife do? A good knife, good means it fulfills its function well. It's good because it fulfills its function well. Okay? So, just to take an example, another example, a good bike is able to ride well. You're able to steer it well. It doesn't fall over. It doesn't get rusty. So goodness is to fulfill its function well. Kant then applies that to human beings and says, what does it mean to be a good person? This isn't to be mixed up with just assuming it means morally good, like a compassionate person or kind person. It is the same thing as the knife. Goodness means to fulfill its function well. Okay? Aristotle uses the word telos, which means purpose or goal. So, as in a moral example, contraception. For the Catholic teachings, the reason the Catholic teachings on contraception are against it is because contraception, look at the telos of sex, having sexual intercourse. Aquinas thought the telos of sex was procreation, to try and create a baby. So if you wear a condom, obviously you are interfering with what he thinks is the true telos of sex, which is procreation. That's the reason why homosexual sex is seen, by Aquinas as being morally wrong, only because you aren't able to procreate. You're not able to have a baby. So if you have anal sex, obviously it's not going to create a baby. Okay, so that's where the Catholic teachings on homosexuality comes from. Another example would be abortion. The telos of an embryo or a fetus is to become a person. Aristotle talked about the difference between potentiality and actuality. An embryo or a fetus is a potential human being. It potentially, if you don't interfere with it and don't have an abortion, that fetus will grow into a person. It's going to become a real person, and there shouldn't be abortion. For the Catholic teachings, abortion is wrong from the moment of conception, because even at the moment of conception, its potentiality is to be a real person with rational desires and choices of their own. The Christian idea is called ensoulment. The Catholic idea is that God gives a fetus a soul at the moment of conception. So coming back to natural law, natural law, Aristotle says that we need to look at what the purpose of human existence is. What does it mean to be human? Why are we here? He says, well, is it just to live? Is it just to exist? Like to keep going, procreate, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Well, Aristotle says, no, it can't be, because other plants and animals exist. That could be part of their purpose, but not necessarily a human's purpose. He then says, what about pleasure, pursuing pleasure? Could that be like a hedonist that just takes ecstasy and drinks lots of booze and eats lots of nice food all the time? A bit like me and my big belly. So Aristotle says, well, if the purpose of human life is just pleasure, we are behaving just like an animal, like a pig rolling around in mud all the time and enjoying itself, or a cow just eating grass all day and chilling out. Animals can pursue pleasure. So he says, no, that's not the purpose of being a human being. The thing that separates us from the animals, and from perhaps the plants as well, according to Aristotle, you might not disagree with it, you might disagree with this about higher animals like gorillas and chimpanzees, but what separates us from the other animals is reasoning, the ability to reason, to make rational choices, to think about, is that right, is that wrong? So Aristotle thinks the purpose of being a human being is to reason well. And if we reason well, we will come out with the right answer. So Catholic teachings, very importantly, natural law is taken by St. Thomas Aquinas. He takes Aristotle's idea and applies it in a Christian way. And basically he says that God gives the telos to things. So God wants the embryo or fetus to become a person. God wants you to stop contraception. That's what Aristotle, this is Aquinas, not Aristotle's teaching. So Aquinas taught natural moral law. He says basically we have to work out the telos of things. There are certain principles that underpin natural law. Like, for example, he says it's the telos of society to be peaceful. That's another thing that Aquinas truly believed, that the telos of having a community is to be peaceful with each other. So Aquinas applies Aristotle's principles of telos to moral issues today. Lots of Catholics don't realise this, that there is so much Greek philosophy. That's why I became a Catholic, because I didn't used to be a Catholic, and I converted to Catholicism, and it was because of Aristotle. I was I was reading up on Aristotle, and I was like, this is amazing. I love Aristotle, and I realised that how much of an impact Aristotle had on the church teachings. So philosophy underpins Catholic teachings, and philosophy would look at, so like, if we take abortion as an example, philosophy will say, well, the telos of an embryo or a fetus is to become a person. Okay, let's stick with that one for the minute. Okay, so anything that stops that process, the abortion process, would be fundamentally wrong. It'd be morally wrong to have an abortion at any stage, even if you've been raped, as far as Catholic teachings, because it's still a life that has a purpose, that deserves to live, because it's not the baby's fault, is it? Or the fetus's fault that the rapist raped them. I know it's a really harsh example, but that's how it's applied. Take it or leave it. That's what it teaches. The philosopher J.S. Mill and Jeremy Bentham, the philosophers J.S. Mill and Jeremy Bentham, came up with a theory called utilitarianism in the 18th century. And utilitarianism completely takes out the God of the equation, and says, well, if there's no God up there to tell us what's right and wrong, how do we decide what's right and wrong? Well, the answer to that is that, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. How do we decide right and wrong? Yes, sorry, the answer to that is that we do the right action, or the correct action, is whatever produces the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. Whatever produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. So if you've got a young unmarried mother, she gets pregnant. The fetus at this stage maybe can't experience pleasure. So the fetus wouldn't even count in the equation. So if the fetus doesn't experience pleasure, she doesn't necessarily experience pleasure, but she experiences pain. She's so worried about having the baby. Her family are worried about her having the baby. She's too young. They think that she's too young. So the utilitarian would say, well, actually, the right thing in the situation for her to do is to have the abortion, Aristotle would say, well, I don't know about Aristotle would probably say it's wrong as well, but I'm not sure about that. But Aquinas would say definitely abortion is wrong, contraception is wrong. Those are two, one sexual ethics example, contraception, and one medical ethics example, which is abortion. So the utilitarian says you take into account all the people that are affected. They are called consequentialists because they look at the consequences, not the act of abortion itself. For Aquinas, the act of abortion is intrinsically wrong. You should not have an abortion. It's intrinsically wrong, the action itself. Whereas for the utilitarian, abortion might be right or wrong, but it's from an instrumental perspective. Because abortion says the end justifies... utilitarianism says the end justifies the means. If the outcome is less pain, that's called negative utilitarianism, is where you focus on reducing pain rather than just pursuing pleasure. You say, well, what's the least painful option? Imagine like a war situation at the end of the Second World War. Dresden was bombed very, very heavily by the Allied forces. There were priests getting up in the Houses of Parliament saying this isn't right. You shouldn't be like really bombing a civilian city that badly, dropping bombs and then dropping more bombs when the paramedics come in to try and save lives. And they said this goes against the just war theory. It's not right. But the argument that was given at the time was that if they didn't bomb Dresden heavily, that the Germans would just keep the war going and they wouldn't give up. So there'd be more suffering. Same principle applies to the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Basically, the Americans believed that they would not give up because of their kind of cultural codes of honor, that they would not give up. And the only way of stopping the war quickly was to drop the atom bomb. So, rightly or wrongly, that's what the utilitarians would say. Whereas St. Thomas Aquinas said you should never have civilian casualties in a war. Never. If you're bombing civilians to try and demoralize your enemy is kind of morally wrong. So that's the contrast between natural law, ethics which focuses on the motive and the action itself. The motive and the action itself in terms of abortion again. Your motive is got to be pure as far as Aquinas. Love of God is a pure motive. And then the action itself, abortion, carrying out the abortion, is seen as intrinsically wrong. Another word you can use is bivalent, that it's actually true that abortion is wrong because God makes it so. God is outside of space and time. He commands the universe. So God is like, for Aristotle, God is not got any potential. Because God is perfect, God hasn't got any potential. Because like, if you take a person developing, a human developing, a philosophy student is never perfect. They are potentially good at philosophy. And they'll get better and better as their life goes on, but they'll never be perfect, whereas God is perfect. God is full actuality. He's the only thing in the universe that's completely full actuality. He hasn't got any potential. So God is perfect. God is outside of space and time. So, utilitarianism versus Aristotle and Aquinas is this kind of balancing act in terms of like, who's more right? Should we focus on the action itself as intrinsically right or wrong? Or should we focus on the consequences of that action and whether the consequences are good or bad and disastrous or good? So it's a huge debate in moral philosophy is between utilitarianism as a atheistic theory. You don't have to believe in God to believe in utilitarianism. Whereas for natural law relies on not all theories of natural law, but for Aquinas, natural law relies on belief in a creator God that's outside of space and time. So, thank you for listening. I'm trying to get my camera set up to be a little bit better, because one of my PowerPoints one of my posts was a bit shaky. I don't know if you can see in the background, I've got my Newcastle United. Newcastle United won the FA Cup in the last time in 1952. So that's my poster of that. It's actually the programme given to me by my granddad, my great granddad. So yeah, that's my wall. So I'm getting better at filming a little bit. I'm not all shaky and lying in bed. So I hope you have enjoyed this contrast between two very important opposing moral philosophers, Bentham versus Aquinas. Who's going to win the battle? What do you think yourselves? Please feel free to write any comments down. I'll be very into philosophy is about dialogue, so I'll be very interested to hear what you've got to say about this. And please like or subscribe to my channel, and I will be posting more philosophy bites in the future. Thank you very much. Bye.